All right. Okay, so it seems like there's some issue and also has been fixed. Okay, so welcome, Christos. So thank you so much for your time. So today, so we are very happy to have Christos. So he has so many affiliations. I don't know. So how should we start? Can you guys hear me? Okay, very good. I guess I'll probably just leave the floor to you because he's going to talk about a very important and very timely topic. Thank you so much, Christos. So by the way, so you have 1 hour. So we may or may not have a question during the talk. So we may stop you. So, but most likely, so we probably have like Q&A towards the end. Right? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Z-Gang. Just before I start, it looks like I need to. Oh, there I can share screen. Okay, perfect.
Right.
You just did that. Great. And then start slideshow. Which one is that again? Slideshow. There we go. Yeah, thank you again, Z-Gang. It's an honor to join everybody here. I remember the first time I met you in person. It was at Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and we were at the hotel, and one of the best computational economists that I had met. And so really excited just to continue this friendship together and be able to present this work. So everybody feel free to interrupt as much as you want and making it lively. This paper is joint with, oops, I forgot to, it's not with Maury, it's with Jonathan Rothwell. This is the first quiz question to make sure people are paying attention, but I forgot to update an old slide, in part because this is actually a paper I was just doing an R&R on last night. So anyways, this paper is about how polarization has been shaping economic outcomes. Everybody talks about political polarization, and I think sometimes there's a supposition that it affects the economy or that it affects people's lives, but actually showing that causally is very tricky to do. So Jonathan Rothwell and I, Jonathan's at Gallup, and we use some really incredible data from Gallup to try to delve into these at the micro level. So it's very fitting that the seminar is a day after the third presidential debate, and that this is a paper about polarization. So when I was preparing for this, I was just going through the news cycle and looking at just different studies that are out there, different headlines. And so there's this general recognition that political polarization is not great, that it draws people further apart, and it's tougher to find those areas of common ground. And actually, one evaluation of the debate was looking at how the debate influenced people's attitudes about which candidate they're going to vote for. And there's two main results that come out of this mini plot that 538 did. The first is just that people's beliefs are like very sticky. So there's just not that much movement. A lot of people's minds have already been made up. And number two is that it seemed to have this, that people that were already thinking of voting for Trump, it might have made them a little bit more likely to actually go out and vote. People that were more likely to vote for Biden, a little bit more likely to go out to vote, and then the opposite effect on them. And so this is capturing this notion of polarization. And this is obviously just one example of it. We're going to be drawing on data from like the past 5 months and how people have been thinking about the pandemic. But I think there's just a lot of anecdotal evidence around, and we're going to try to bring some really concrete micro data to bear on this. What we're going to do here is two main things, but we're going to be tackling this broader question of, well, we know political affiliation matters for influencing beliefs, and we know that beliefs matter for influencing real economic activity. So we're going to try to bring these two insights together to inform the sort of macro models and that people might want to write down to understand aggregate fluctuations. We're going to be drawing on the most comprehensive, nationally representative, and what we think is geographically fine data available. This is going to be from the Gallup organization, where they survey about 1,000 people every day, starting in mid-March at the onset of the pandemic. And it's not the same person every day, but there is a panel component to it. In particular, people can be surveyed about up to 3 times during that duration. So we're going to have some time series variation on a given person. And what's also nice here is that, so it's nationally representative. That's important because a lot of the polls that are out there, you ask people who they're voting for, and if it's on a sample of people that are likely to vote Trump or likely to vote Democrat, you're not necessarily going to get an externally valid answer from it. It's also very geographically fine. What we mean by that is that we can drill down to the county level or the zip code level. That's useful because we want to exploit geographic heterogeneity in the exposure to the pandemic, i.e. we know that somebody in New York City is going to be experiencing a different level of the pandemic than somebody in Maricopa County in Phoenix or in Arizona, or in a smaller county in Idaho. So what we're going to do is two main things here. Number one, I'm going to spend like the first half of the presentation trying to convince you that that the biggest determinant of beliefs about the pandemic, i.e. Do people think that it's going to end soon? Do people think that it's going to have a really big economic negative effect? That those beliefs are best explained by political affiliation, not by age, not by race, not by education, not by whether you're unemployed or not even the actual level of coronavirus cases or deaths in your county. The second thing that we're going to do, kind of motivated by that first result, is say, well, given that beliefs seem to be driven heavily by political affiliation, how might that feed into the types of policies that states adopt? And in turn, influence real economic behavior. Because we kind of think about it, this might be an overly simple way of thinking about the world, but if we think about people form beliefs, those beliefs influence policy, and then policy has an effect on local and state outcomes. That's going to be kind of that supply chain. And the weakest part of this paper is not going to be that first part. It's going to be the causality in the second part. So we totally recognize that there are going to be some endogenous factors here. We're going to do our best to control. We've got an IV strategy that we haven't put fully to use in this draft, but we are going to at least try to argue that there's some really useful descriptive evidence behind that. So yeah, before I go on, does anyone have any questions about kind of the roadmap and the motivation for this paper?
Christos, I have two questions.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, go for it.
So number one, just curious, what is the time frame you're looking at? So the reason why I look at that is yesterday I was watching the seminar by Holmström. He compared, right? So he was comparing the data of Finland versus Sweden, and apparently, so they have a drastically different approach in terms of COVID-19. And yes, it had economic impact, but it turns out it takes a while to have the impact. So that's right. My question for you. Based on his data, takes between like 7 to 12 weeks to see the impact of different policy. This is number one. Number two question is, so yeah, a while ago I was watching a seminar by Chetty, and he has comprehensive data. And one point he was trying to make is, so he compared Wisconsin versus maybe Minnesota, I forgot. So like a natural experience. So these two states has very different policy, or I mean, it's a different timing in terms of the policy. But turns out, so the consumer behave more or less the same. The point I was trying to make is, so maybe the general public or the household or individual, they may just naturally respond to what happens instead of waiting for those politicians to make the policy. So that may affect your results, because I haven't seen your result yet. So this is just my two questions.
Yeah. No, so let me answer the easier question first, and then come back to like this philosophical argument, and that I think has very concrete empirical implications. So first is that our time frame is pretty wide. We start in March and we go until July. We're also thinking of updating with August and September in a new iteration of this paper. The reason, obviously, why that time frame matters is that early in the pandemic, I mean, if we had just been kind of rushed to produce a paper and release it at the end of March, or I mean, maybe April or something like that, it would have been hard to say anything concrete about the impact that it was having on actual on economic activity, because it obviously takes time for these things to show up. So that's totally right. And we incorporate lags and allow for, we compute some impulse response functions that allow for that lagged dependency. The second thing that you brought up is just like comparison between different countries or different states, and to what extent are individuals just responding to policy versus driving it. The way that we think about, well, I mean, like California and New York City, California and New York are really good illustrations here, because one of the, they're two states that have had some of the most restrictive policies. And so part of our argument is that a state with a certain composition of voters, i.e. More Democrat or more Republican voters, that it's going to be easier for the governor, for the state legislator to enact laws that are catering to that particular group. So it's easier for California to enact restrictions than it would be for Texas or Arizona. And indeed, you saw like kind of an opposite response. In Arizona, it was a little too lax. And in fact, I mean, I grew up in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, and Doug Ducey and some of the state legislators there allowed like bars to open up really quickly, and maybe that wasn't the best response. So I think you're totally right that people are, like individuals are responding, but I think the legislators and the governors are also looking at who are my constituents and how much pushback am I going to receive if I do X, Y, or Z. Does that get at the question?
Yeah, thanks for the answers. So maybe we just wait for your looking for your the results.
Yeah, the empirical model. Yeah. And I mean, like I just again caveat this by saying like there's obviously this interplay, and getting at the causality here is very difficult. And if people have recommendations about how to isolate some of those exogenous movements, we're very keen to hear those suggestions. Before I go to the data and the empirical strategy, I want to further motivate why we think this is like a really first order question. So what we're doing in these plots is looking at different outcomes at a state level, and we're looking at how states that voted for Trump versus voted for Clinton during the 2016 election fared. And so I'm just going to take you through maybe like 2 or 3 of these. I mean, obviously it's pretty easy to interpret all of these, but starting at that top middle one, you can see that there's a huge wedge in the states that had stay-at-home orders, namely that the ones that were voted for Trump were much less likely to enact. And if they did enact, they removed the stay-at-home orders much sooner, whereas like places like California kept it in a lot longer. You also see a gap in small business revenue growth, which is something that we take from the Chetty and Opportunity Insights tracker. We take that from their data set. And there's this wedge between the two. There's a wedge in consumer spending, unemployment rate. Obviously, retail visits is kind of mechanically correlated with these stay-at-home orders and the non-essential business closure orders. So all our point was that we want to drive in here is that when you look at the raw data at a state level, there are some very meaningful gaps that emerge. We're going to try to unpack whether that holds true when you boil down to the micro level. A second thing that we want to just put out there is that there's also this massive gap in how individuals' beliefs have been forming and whether or not they're Democrat or Republican. And so because our Gallup data that I'm going to go into in another slide or two, because this data allows us to see the individual, and again, it's a large sample, about 1,500 to 1,000 people every day, we see their political affiliation and then their beliefs. We can compute these averages separately by group. And so you can see for social distancing that at the onset of the pandemic, there was a lot more homogeneity, but as time elapsed, these beliefs really diverged. And so Democrats continue to believe that social distancing is very important. Yeah, so basically this is the y-axis is just plotting the share of individuals that believe that social distancing is important and that they're participating in it. Same thing with social isolation. Mask wearing is like nearly, or at least, again, like what people say versus what they actually do is different. We saw some of the reporting that Cuomo, CNN anchor, wasn't always wearing his mask in his building. But point being is that there's at least this big perception gap in terms of what people are doing. And also the expected disruption. This was really interesting. It was that a lot of Democrats and Republicans thought that the economic ramifications of the pandemic would be very different. Basically, this y-axis was showing that about like 100% of Democrats thought that this would have pretty much like a very negative effect well after the December, whereas Republicans thought that they would be resolved a little bit sooner. So anyways, bottom line is that raw data suggests a very stark contrast. So what are we going to do for the meat of the paper? I want to preview the questions that are asked in this Gallup data because one of the things that I was waving my hands a little bit with in the prior two plots was just showing you some of the descriptive evidence. But as we go forward, I want to be clear about what we're measuring and some of the limitations that it has. So there's about 6 questions that we're going to show you in terms of beliefs. The first one is around expected disruption over the pandemic. So it's Gallup was asking respondents, how do you think this level of disruption that's occurring with travel, school, et cetera, will continue before it starts to improve? And so what I was showing you before was individuals that say for the rest of the year or longer than this year. So that's essentially we're creating this indicator variable equal to 1 if it's equal to 3 or 4, 0 otherwise. We're also asking people about how worried they are about the illness. And so again, we're grouping together people that are somewhat worried and very worried. We've also done some robustness where we, instead of grouping together 3 and 4, we just look at 4. And then social distancing in a similar vein, it's asking about how often people are practicing these sorts of policies. And one of the counter arguments that some people have about this sort of data is that it's based on subjective self-reports. We kind of have 2 thoughts on this. Number one is that we've actually benchmarked this to actual social distancing, like hard data. There's some data from Unicast, for example, where they use mobile phone technology. I don't know, I'm actually a little bit scared that this is like possible to do. It's like maybe a little bit infringement of policy, but like Unicast can like dial into people's phones and track where it's moving. And so they can see how much people are going outdoors and then compare that relative to pre-pandemic. And so we've done some benchmarking where we can show that social distancing in our data predicts what Unicast is picking up at a county level. But in addition to that, what we're interested in is beliefs and how people are forming expectations. So at the end of the day, while we want there to be a correspondence between beliefs and like what's actually happening, what we really care about are our beliefs.
Excuse me, Christos.
Yeah,
one more. So like when you show us a drastic difference between political belief, so I'm just wondering to what extent, so the wage was driven by their political affiliation or the difference in terms of their education and income level?
Yeah. No, that's really important because especially when people talk about the average Trump voter in the 2016 election being middle class, without a college degree, et cetera, those other omitted variables could potentially lead to some spurious results. I'm going to show you in about 3 slides the table that breaks it out. And the short answer is very interesting that educational attainment, race, income don't matter that much for explaining beliefs. Political affiliation matters much more. And then actually, you might have seen some papers by actually forgetting some of the names right now, but there's a gentleman at Johns Hopkins, another Greek guy actually. So I definitely should be in trouble for forgetting his name. We talk about it in the paper, but there's some other survey evidence that emphasizes the role of demographic factors. One of the things that we show in the full paper is that demographic factors matter for us too, but after you control for political affiliation, the statistical and economic significance on those other variables actually decline. So education, race decline in significance after you put in political affiliation. So that's a short answer, but I'm going to get to it in another couple slides.
Do you model the choice for political affiliation at all, or is it exogenous?
Yeah, this boy, I mean,
Endogenous?
we're kind of treating political affiliation here as exogenous, that like going into the pandemic, people already have beliefs. And I think this is where taking your suggestion more seriously, because we have panel data, is that we would be able to see how much people switch. And it could be that bad handling of the pandemic at a state level might lead people to switch. So that's something that we've been thinking about. Do you have further thoughts about how we might want to do that?
No, I just know that I'm familiar with some of the research for political outcome and religious choice. And I know
Yeah.
that there's work that shows that they are endogenous, basically. And so that the same characteristics that drive one's political choice are also the ones that drive one's religious beliefs.
Yeah.
That they're not causal, they're just all coming from the same human factors. So it just, when you start talking about beliefs being a function of political choice, it just sounds a little.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things, and that's where, like, doing some of the true causal inference, we would need like a really good IV or a really good natural experiment. We're kind of thinking of, here's a horse race between all these different potential explanations. We're going to put in these different variables, but I think one of the big limitations here is that you could tell a story where maybe there's some sort of reverse causality. One of the ways that we try to get around this is by looking at different subgroups or different states where we think that certain policy choices would have been more salient over things like religious affiliation, which are more time invariant. So somebody comes into the pandemic already having made a particular choice about whether they're Christian, atheist, or whatnot, whereas some of the state policies are faster moving and more likely to move them on the political dial. But I mean, it's just one of the limitations we have, and we do need to do more work there. So point taken.
Political affiliation or the candidate for whom one votes.
Yeah.
You know, I know lots of Democrats who vote the other way, depending upon who the candidate is, and there'll be lots of Republicans voting for a Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
So that's another issue, is whether or not it's truly the party affiliation or it's the candidate. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm taking away, so I'll stop.
No, those are very valid points. And I mean, my gut reaction is I mean, that's certainly true. It's a matter of, like, on average, how much is that going to potentially bias our results. So while the candidate always matters, political affiliation on average will have like a marginal effect on what people are going to vote for.
I agree. Those affiliations are typically long-term, like a religious affiliation.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, one thing that I don't have the plots here, is that we look at how much switching is occurring, and we put in person fixed effects into our baseline specification, and we show that these effects on political affiliation remain. And so that's identifying the effect of political affiliation on beliefs based off of those switchers. So that's something that maybe I should have put the table in. But yeah, no, it's fair.
I'll stop. Thanks.
Oh yeah, no worries. Feel free to jump in anytime. It's that's nature of these sort of talks. It's great. So just to be really quick on some of the other variables that we measure, self-isolation is kind of capturing the same social distancing policies. Mask wearing, I mean, I don't want to read it out to you. I mean, you can see it, and it's pretty self-evident. And then lastly, whether or not somebody visited work. And so one of the things that actually we found is kind of interesting, and I'm doing some work with Eric Vinyalson and Alex Moss and John Horton around this, is the incidence of remote work. And so one thing that we don't have a paper on, but like one thing we've run some diagnostics over is that it seems to be that individuals are more likely to be receptive to like delaying the reopening and keeping things kind of locked down a little bit more if they're a remote worker. I mean, that's probably not a surprise. Like, as academics, not that everybody's life is easy, but it's like easier for us to cope with a lot of the disruption than somebody that, like, I mean, my parents, for example, own a Greek restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's been really, really difficult for them to, they had to shut down, and their entire business model has been kind of upended. So that's just like one interesting feature of this data set that we're able to exploit, but that we haven't done fully. Okay, So now some of the good stuff that's going to get into some of these questions about omitted variables and what's causal and what's not. Our primary econometric model is just going to be relating indicators of people's beliefs. So, i.e., going back to like this survey question 1 about you're equal to 1 if you say 3 or 4, that this disruption is lasting at least till the end of the year. And then we're going to be regressing that on measure of political affiliation, whether or not you're Republican, Democrat, normalized to being independent. We're going to also put in measures of logged cumulative COVID-19 cases and deaths to control for what's actually happening at a local level. We've also done put in some controls for the unemployment rate, because we were also recognizing the fact that like certain states and counties, and we were looking specifically at counties, are going to be much more adversely affected based on the composition of their industry. So more restaurants, more IT is going to have very different effects. Turned out the unemployment rate wasn't really coming in as statistically significant, which I mean was kind of a surprise to us. I mean, would have thought that people like changes in that really mattered. We could also measure somebody's individual employment status, so not just looking at the county, but actually whether or not you're unemployed. And then we put that into D. So D is just like a demographic, a bunch of demographic factors: age, race, education. I should put education here. But employment status, whether or not you have children in your household, which is obviously important for if your children can't go into daycare or to school, that's going to affect your beliefs as well. And lastly, we control for fixed effects on county and on year. So we really want to be comparing. The exercise to have in your mind is, okay, so California residents are different than Arizona residents. We want to look at people within California or within a county in California. One is Republican, one is Democrat, one is independent. And we want to see how their beliefs evolve over this time period, controlling for demographic factors. Okay. So what do we find? There's a lot of numbers on this table, but I just want to emphasize a couple, which is just in this red box. So what we can see here is that just looking at column 1, for example, is that being Republican is going to make you about 18 percentage points less likely to expect that disruption is going to take longer than the end of the year. So Republicans are going to be more likely to think that it's actually going to kind of resolve itself before the end of the year, whereas Democrats are going to be about 11 percentage points more likely relative to independents to think that it's going to take longer than the rest of the year. You can see that the actual number of infections is only significant at a 10% level. It's also very economically insignificant. We also looked at whether you're out of the workforce. That came out to be pretty economically insignificant as well. I mean, at a 10% level, but only 4 percentage points less likely, which we thought, just in terms of comparing magnitudes, that if you're unemployed, that's exerting less of an effect than political affiliation. We also looked at the gender, age. So gender really wasn't statistically significant. Age was. I think age is probably capturing a little bit of the kind of seniority effect of like where you are within your organizational hierarchy, how much human capital you have. We also looked at different educational attainment measures. We found that college degree didn't really matter that much. Graduate degree did. I think the graduate degree is probably proxying for more likely to be in more technical jobs, in particular jobs that are more digitally intensive. Some college, I was actually a little bit surprised to find that positive. I would have thought maybe it would go in the other direction. For race, we found generally statistically insignificant effects, although if you're Black, you're 3 percentage points more likely to expect that this disruption is going to take longer. So I'm not going to take you through, I'm not going to do the same thing on each one of these just because I don't want to like put you to sleep, but I just wanted to start with economic disruption and then mention something similar is going on with each of these. So political affiliation, regardless of outcome, seems to matter more than these other these other characteristics. The only case where we were finding some really strong statistically significant results was kind of more on mask wearing and self-isolation, where we found that, I mean, age, gender, educational attainment did matter a lot. I think the reason for this probably has to do again with the remote ability and how digitally intensive some of these jobs are. So if you are have a bachelor's degree or have a college degree, you're going to be more likely to be concentrated in certain digitally intensive jobs than others. On this next slide, there's not much information here. It's just like not all of it fit on one because of all the different characteristics. So I just wanted to FYI put these other sample characteristics that every column here was controlling for time fixed effects, county fixed effects. We also added in state by time fixed effects and specifications. And then the R squared and the sample size. The last thing before moving on, or I guess I'll ask if anyone has questions before moving on, but was that having medical conditions, a serious medical issue, not surprisingly makes people a little bit more worried. So if you have a medical condition, you're 5 percentage points more likely to expect that there's going to be economic disruption. You're also more likely to expect that you're going to have contract the illness, which is, true. Extra comorbidities are associated with that, and also you're more likely to engage in social distancing, self-isolation, wearing a mask, and a little bit less likely to go to work, although it wasn't as statistically significant. So before moving on, any questions about some of these baseline results where we were kind of treating it like a horse race? We just put in these different characteristics. All right, great. So the second thing that I want to move on, and this is really where I wanted to spend the second half of this presentation, is saying that if all that we show is that individual beliefs are a function of these political affiliation, that's not that surprising. So it'd be hard for us to publish that result. But two is I think for actually impacting the way that we think about the world, it's maybe a little bit less interesting. So what we want to show is that one of the reasons why beliefs might matter is because it influences the types of policies that states adopt. And the reason being, and this goes back to Zhigang's question earlier, is that governors might be more likely to adopt policies that are more restrictive if they think that their voters are going to be okay with that. And so there's different theories for why policy is passed, and we're going to be able to provide some microeconomic evidence consistent with one of those theories. So I'll get into that soon. But the first empirical exercise that we're going to start out here is going to be relating indicators for whether or not a state adopted a particular policy. So whether or not they have a stay-at-home order, a non-essential business closure order, mask wearing policy, and then we're going to regress that on the share of individuals at a state level that voted for Trump. We can also use, we've also done robustness where we use our own measure from the Gallup data of political affiliation. The reason why we actually defaulted to this goes exactly to the point that Michelle brought up earlier, that political affiliation might be different than what people actually vote for. And so we thought maybe it's better just to use what people actually voted for in the 2016 election. Admittedly, the counter argument to that is okay, well, there's been a couple of years that have elapsed. People might have changed. So that's why in the appendix, we also do some robustness using the Gallup data. But anyways, we also control for the actual number of COVID cases and deaths at the state level. And then G of D is a semi-parametric function where we're not throwing our hands up in the air and saying endogeneity is impossible to solve. We're waving our, we're doing a little bit more of a waving our hands when we say endogeneity is also obviously an issue, but we're going to try to take some of these controls as seriously as possible by controlling for population density, the age distribution, the education distribution, the racial distribution, and then also the industry distribution, namely the share of people in manufacturing and agriculture and retail and et cetera, et cetera. It's listed here. But we think that that's a really useful exercise to do, because if somebody thought all that Trump voter share was explaining was omitted heterogeneity in education or race or industry, adding in these controls allows us to rule out that explanation. And one of the things that I love about a lot of the applied micro exercises that we can do is that we get to be kind of creative with the data. And so we can look at a raw correlation, and then we can add on controls sequentially. And as Engrist and Pischke talk about this, the balancing test and coefficient comparison test, we can gauge how that coefficient changes as the controls get sequentially added. So let me show you the baseline result. So what we can show here is we're going to show two sets of results. One with the baseline controls without the industry composition effects, and then with the industry composition effects. So our outcome variable in column 1 and 2 is an indicator for whether or not that state adopted non-essential business closure orders. All states pretty much adopted these, so we're going to be looking within state. We're going to be exploiting some of the not just cross-sectional, but also some of the time series variation. And then we regress that on the Trump share in 2016. Not surprisingly, increases in the Trump share in 2016 is negatively associated with the adoption of the non-essential business closure orders. You can also see that the more COVID cases, that new infections, that led to an increase in the probability that they adopted it. What's interesting, though, is that once you add on these industry compositional effects, that correlation actually grows in an absolute value, and in particular, it becomes more negative. And so if somebody thought, hey, this unobserved heterogeneity in the composition of workers is just driving all of that, and after you add in these controls, that correlation will go away. That's not what we find. And also, the same thing holds for these stay-at-home orders, that it seems to be that there's this polarization that emerges, and then it just strengthens after you add in these industry employment composition effects. Lastly, there was some concern in at least the media that this was just being driven by differential rates of testing, and that political affiliation was driving the overall amount of testing. That doesn't seem to be the case. States were in generally like testing as much as they could, or if they weren't testing as much as they could, maybe that was due to some other idiosyncratic factor in just the effectiveness of the bureaucracy, but it doesn't seem to be at all associated with political affiliation. So the last thing I'll mention before moving on from this slide is that, again, these results are robust to using, rather than the 2016 voting share, also the share of individuals using self-reported political affiliation. And also, in more recent months, Gallup has had better polling on preferences about the presidential election. It's just that going back to March, that was not like not really their primary concern. So if we're trying to exploit the full panel, we can only collapse this down in certain months, not going all the way back to March. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Jigang.
Just minor question. So toward the end, so you have adjusted R star, R2, or the size. So the 9,600, so that's the size, no?
Oh, sorry. So yeah, great question. How is it that big? Because there's not that many states. So we are using daily data on this, and I think that was the main thing here. I need to go back and check if Jonathan just matched this into his individual level data and then ran the regressions with the individual level. I mean, we're clustering standard errors at the state level, so the coefficients aren't going to change. But I believe that the answer was just that we are doing day by state. So it's
thank you.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so what are the different theories for why policies get adopted? There's three main. So Jonathan is actually more of a political scientist. He did his PhD at Princeton and has really studied more of the poli-sci element of this than me. But there's three main theories that we're trying to provide some micro evidence of. And I think this kind of eases the burden on us a little bit, because we're not trying to like say, okay, here's the causal effect of this on this. We're trying to say, here's some micro evidence that helps us think about the world a little bit differently. And there's these different political science theories that people will put out there without data. We're going to have some data that allows us to kind of like reject some theories and then give a little bit of evidence for others. So there's like a fancy word for something that's kind of simple: majoritarian electoral democracy. It's kind of like in macro, we've got these fancy names like Hank models and dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. The DSD equivalent for poli-scientists is majoritarian electoral democracy, which basically says that the average voter is going to influence policy. It's a little bit similar to like the median voter hypothesis, where what policymakers look at is like what the median voter is saying. We're going to provide some evidence that yes, the average voter influences policy, but that political affiliation is really one of the factors that's driving the results. And so like policymakers in California, because the composition is heavily Democratic, they're going to cater more to those types of constituents versus, and I mean, this is one thing that you see a lot in the headlines, and at least that I've been seeing, is like in California, a lot of the churches have had a lot of difficulty opening up, whereas it's been easier for other groups like to open up, like marijuana shops to open up. And so when you think about the demographic characteristics of the voters there's like a very, just like looking at the data, there's a rational reason why the policymakers are behaving the way that they did. So that's what majoritarian electoral democracy is kind of getting at. The other two theories are a little bit, I mean, also pretty easy to explain about the poli-sci literature. They emphasize that interest groups really drive what policymakers are doing, and so they're catering to specific lobbyist groups. We don't have phenomenal data on this point because, again, we don't see whether or not like a person is exactly a lobbyist or like what organizations they're a part of, but we see some proxies for this. The third theory is about like the elites. The elites are what's driving policy, and we can proxy for this in a couple ways. The easiest way is just to look at income bracket, and so some of the poli-sci papers focus on, okay, people above this threshold are the ones with access and the ones with influence, and so we can actually see somebody's income, and we can test for this directly. Okay, so what do we find? We're going to test for some of these theories sequentially, but what we're going to do is to really get at this concept of how political affiliation influences beliefs, is that we're going to interact whether or not you're Republican with whether or not you have a Republican governor. So in other words, if you're living in Arizona and you're Republican, you're very likely to agree with what Doug Ducey has been doing versus if you're a Democrat. I mean, you might still agree with what Ducey is doing, because in general, he's like I think he's a good governor. I like him, but there's just this attachment between like your affiliation and then like what your governor is, and the same thing for a Democrat. And this is going to get at some of this partisan politics idea. Not surprisingly, I mean, like we look at I mean, whether or not you're Republican, whether or not you're Democrat, Democrats were a little bit more likely to be critical of what the state government was doing, but I mean, we can't really statistically differentiate these. What we do find is that there's a strong partisanship, that if you have the same a party affiliation as your governor, you're more likely to agree with what they're doing. The second column is going to try to get at this concept of interest groups, and this is like one of the weak parts of the paper, and I'm actually, I mean, curious if people have better ideas for how to proxy for this. But we thought, okay, one way to proxy is by looking at whether or not you're a small business owner, because specifically because during this time and with the Paycheck Protection Program, that there was this really big influence, I mean, across the aisle around providing support for small businesses, and that's why it was like not easy, but it was doable to pass like the largest federal intervention for small businesses ever in the United States history through the CARES Act. And so we thought this is one useful group to use as an interest group. And so we don't have like 10 other proxies for this, so I'm not going to lie and say like this is one of like 10 different proxies. But with this, we found that there was like no statistical significance here, no economic significance about whether or not that predicts the approval for what your state is doing. It seemed that like small businesses just across the board didn't really have super strong opinions about it. The third thing that we looked at was income, whether or not like elites are really driving policy. And so again, we didn't really find any evidence that was the case. We put on this indicator for whether or not you're above earning over 60K a year and above 100K and 180K a year, and we didn't really find any statistically significant results there. So this is, I mean, we need to, there's more work that we did in the actual paper, but in terms of the 1 hour presentation, what I wanted to get out there was just showing that it seems that this majoritarian electoral democracy hypothesis is what has some of the most microeconomic support so far. And all these specifications have state and time fixed effects. So we're comparing individuals like within the same state, which is why we can't control for whether or not you're a Republican governor, because that's collinear with the state fixed effect, and we can only exploit variation on the interaction.
Quick question. So what's the dependent variable? So this is individual's approval or? Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, so whether or not an individual approves of their state government's policy response for the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the last, pretty much the last main exercise that I'm going to show you. There's one other thing that I'll show you that I'm going to wave my hands a little bit on, but is how might these beliefs have in turn fed into actual state economic policy outcomes, actually county level, not state. And so we're going to be taking three main outcome variables. Retail visits as one proxy. And again, retail visits is obviously going to be correlated with stay-at-home orders and non-essential business orders. So we're going to be looking also at credit card spending, which is from the affinity data that Russ, Shetty, and Opportunity Insights has made available, and small business revenue data. These outcome variables are going to be interpreted as percentage point changes relative to the pre-pandemic baseline. So the way that that Shetty et al. Have put this up online is by they have it normalized relative to before the pandemic. We're also going to, the key right-hand side variable is going to be whether or not the state has implemented a stay-at-home order, a non-essential business closure order, and a mask requirement. We're also going to control for various characteristics at a county level, most notably the county logged number of new infections. And then we're also going to put on fixed effects for county and for time. So the main result here is going to be that these stay-at-home orders and non-essential business closure orders had a very adverse effect on retail visits and on credit card spending and on, in the next slide, small business revenue growth. But let me just walk you through the interpretation here. So like it's just saying that the introduction of a stay-at-home order led to about a 1 percentage point decline in credit card spending using this county level data. This is where the time horizon matters, going back to what Zgang kind of pointed out earlier. It's like how much data do you have? What we don't have in this table is that if we lengthen the sample, we find like a more statistically significant response. This was just going up until July. Non-essential business closure orders also negatively associated with it. What's interesting, and then with small business, it was much more statistically significant. So like what this is picking up, yeah, let me kind of figure out the order to do this in. Okay, so for credit card spending, like you probably see headlines, and I mean, maybe we're all part of this statistic, is that we've been ordering on Amazon. I still order Amazon Fresh every other week to get my groceries. I still order like my spirulina and chlorella nutrient supplements on Amazon, but I don't go out to restaurants. I mean, actually, I'm a bad example. I didn't really go out to restaurants before the pandemic either. I tend to cook. My parents run a Greek restaurant, so cooking is in the family. So the average person would just like go out more prior to the pandemic. Now they're just substituting that. And that's why I think this response is attenuated here. But for small business revenue growth, that's where we find that really negative association that is significant at the 1% level. The second key result here is that mask requirements are not negatively associated with this, or at least statistically significant with any of these adverse outcomes. So one of the implications that we draw in the paper is that part of the reason why the economic effect has been so significant has been because states responded in this polarized response, where they really went on this like huge lockdown or like not doing anything at all. And if states instead had been a little bit more middle of the road, where they were like suggesting guidance around wearing masks, and they did that from the get-go, maybe the transmission would have been lower. And I obviously, none of us like love wearing masks. I mean, maybe it'll become a fashion trend in another like couple of years, but none of us love wearing it. But the cost of wearing it is like low compared to like locking down and my parents not being able to have their restaurant open and so on. So that's one of the main takeaways from this table. Before I go on to that last component of the presentation, any questions on this so far? Okay, great. Oh yeah, Zgang?
Yeah, sir. So somebody else has a question. So it seems like a non-essential business closure has bigger impact than stay-at-home order.
Yeah, it seems like non-essential business. Let's go back to what was you're looking at small business revenue growth or
everywhere? I mean, let's look at the retail visit.
Yeah, retail visits are being pretty adversely affected by this. So what was the question though? So
I mean, why non-essential business closure has stronger impact on stay-at-home?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is where like some of the econometric work that we do is sometimes a little bit more storytelling. The reality is we don't have a fantastic explanation here. I mean, like when we were thinking about this, non-essential business closures were the length that they were enacted for was different, and so a lot more states seem to relax the stay-at-home orders a little bit sooner than some of the non-essential business closure orders. So it's like this policy was just in place longer in certain states, and so it's having a little bit more deleterious effect. Whereas other ones are just like said, okay, April was, we didn't know what was going on in April. We're going to do this stay-at-home order and non-essential business closure order. But then once like later in May, they relaxed it. I think that's what's going on, but hard to say for sure. Alrighty, so the last thing that we want to do before I conclude is saying that what we have characterized in these prior two slides is the cost of these state policies. What we're not able to capture is some of the benefits of them. And so one, like a really, like somebody that is like a huge fan of the lockdowns can say, we really needed them because they are preventing the transmission of the disease, and the costs are worth it because of these big benefits. So one of the things that we like, again, this is not like a medical paper. We're not trying to get in the middle of that debate. But we do want to do a little bit of econometric work there. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but let me preview what I'm going to show you. We're going to take logged cases, cumulative COVID-19 cases and deaths, and then we're going to regress that on a lagged value because we want to control for the vast amount of persistence in COVID cases. And in some cases, you can like look at the delta, or you can look at like levels and then control for the lag. They're not equivalent, but they're very similar. And then we want to control for lags and leads on stay-at-home orders, on non-essential business closure orders, and on mask policies. And then we want to do a little bit of a horse race to see how much do each of these policies predict in terms of reducing the transmission, reducing the number of deaths. And so basically what we find, and so that we don't need to go through all these numbers, and actually one thing that we maybe should just do in the paper is like plot it instead of like tables. I think plots are usually better than tables. But what we find is that mask policies had at least as beneficial of an effect on reducing the transmission and on reducing deaths as other policies. So if at the end of the day we can win that mask policies are at least as good and they're less costly, then the Pareto response would just be to just do them and not do the lockdowns. And that's more or less what we find is like that these stay-at-home orders and the non-essential business orders didn't have that much of a beneficial effect, actually, like when you pool all the data and you just put it into an econometric model. But mask policies had a very statistically negative effect. So positive effect on public health, negative effect on cases. Not much of an effect on deaths, but at least in public. The masks in business seem to reduce the deaths, but the masks in public didn't seem to. So we kind of a little bit of mixed evidence there, but bottom line is that it seems like a Pareto response could just be to do that. So in conclusion, I see like 2 minutes left or 4 minutes left. I don't want to repeat myself, but just to say, this paper has really been trying to connect the dots between the literature about how people form beliefs and then the polarization literature. And we wanted to try to provide some micro evidence about how might beliefs actually influence real economic activity, and connect with that political science literature about how policies get passed and what policymakers are really responding to. Are they responding to just the wealthy? Are they responding to interest groups? Or are they responding rationally to what their constituents say? And it seems to be that like the average voter in California is just different than the average voter in Arizona or Texas. And so they respond differently to these policies. And so what we need among public policymakers is to be a little bit more cautious and more balanced in if they want to do optimal policy, they should not just respond to kind of the extremes where they're just like, okay, we have to shut things down completely, or like, oh no, it's like nothing. So that's this paper. It's kind of like this mix between like a micro to macro paper, but I really appreciate your attentiveness and happy to, I guess we don't, three more minutes, but happy to also talk more offline if it's of interest.
All right, thank you so much, Christos, for your wonderful presentation. So do we have other questions? I do have some questions, so maybe just wait for other audience to speak.
I had a quick question. So first of all, I think it's a really, really important topic. So I loved hearing about all this. So a lot of beliefs, things that we call beliefs, end up being very heritable. And I think, was it Jonathan Pallison that you mentioned? He's a genetics guy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he knows he knows this stuff really well, I'm sure. So these heritability studies they do with twins separated at birth, identical twins, they figured out that political identity is like 58% genetic, right? So I don't even know if this is a question as much as just to hear your thoughts on what this means for your research. But if it's that much ingrained in us, and then other similar beliefs or even very different beliefs, but they're driven by the same genetic makeup of these individuals, you know, collectively groups, of course. But what does that mean in terms of, you know, how we address the polarization? We're born different. You know, that's not always politically correct to say that we're born different, but all the research says that we are. So what does that mean in terms of policy? What does it mean in terms of crisis, disaster responses, and the economics of it, of course? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, saving a good macro philosophical question. So we could probably talk for hours about this. I'm not like an expert on that literature. I know my understanding of it is that there is like a lot of back and forth about the role that traits play. I also am aware, I think there was like a recent JPE paper that showed that you can predict decisions using like the genome pretty well. And so I mean, there's so much endogeneity there, and so how much of it is like a variance decomposition versus like the causal effect? It's certainly the case that like people are born different, and I think that there's so much confusion in today's society about like recognizing that people have different tastes, people have different strengths. Like I'm not Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I mean like I could work out in the gym a lot, but I'm probably not going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger. I also am not able to shoot like free throws. I'm not 6'5" or whatnot. So we're born different for sure. But I think the implications of these results is that, and especially like how policymakers respond to political affiliation, is that people do form beliefs, and it's over a period of time. The fact that our results still, and maybe this should be a result that we put in the slides, is that the fact that we still find that political affiliation matters after putting in person fixed effects suggests that it's not as if these things are like, it's not as if policymakers can say, okay, I don't need to worry about things because like this is the way that things always are and they're always going to be. There is this back and forth iterative process that policymakers need to go through, that constituents should go through, that we all need to go through in our own reflective process. So I think from a statistical point of view, it's not as if unobserved heterogeneity is driving everything, at least in this. As a philosophical point of view, I'm a huge believer in like the role that environment plays, but definitely also agree that we're endowed with different talents.
Sure. I think we're a lot more comfortable admitting that with physical things like your Schwarzenegger example, but we're a little bit less comfortable acknowledging it with things like political identity or ethical stances on various issues. So just thought I'd get your take on that. So yeah, thanks for your response there.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Be a good follow-up paper to write is like using the time series variation, try to understand how, well, I don't know, there's only so much that we can do with this data because it's good that Gallup doesn't have people's genome. That would be a little bit scary, but we could do more with the time series. But great. Well, thank you again, Z-Gang, for reaching out, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to get to know all of you, and again, happy to take feedback offline and make any of those edits.
Thank you so much for again for your time. Do we have other questions?
I have one. So for your research, what would be considered like an outlier or like something that you can't necessarily record?
Wait, how so? You mean in the specification or relating beliefs with political affiliation, or?
Yeah. Somewhere around there.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think is always good as applied microeconomists to do is like just look at the raw data. I mean, we found some kind of like outliers where there were some people that were just like always negative, and so like as things in the state actually improved, and like so the COVID situation improved, the employment situation improved, they just stayed negative. So I mean that was one outlier that we found, and I guess that goes to the vast amount of individual level heterogeneity that exists in some of these subjective expectation variables.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
All right. More questions? I mean, so I have a question. So this probably just circle back to the earlier discussion and Michelle's point. So by the way, so Michelle, so she's our dean. So she asked a few excellent question. So I guess, so my question is kind of related to hers. So I guess, so, or maybe also just related to Brandon's the concern. So I guess, so the fundamentally, there may be some some factors is going to affect your political belief and other observables. I guess that's kind of related to that, right? Because either is maybe it's like either your gene or something else that can determine your political belief, and also that's going to determine your educational level, income level, ability level, so on and so forth. And so maybe fundamentally there's one thing is going to determine everything, but somehow what we saw is there's a strong correlation between your political belief and your socioeconomic status and towards what is your decision. I understand it's very difficult. It's very difficult to find. So yeah, so you don't, and you already explained to me, so what you have done, so I guess that's fine. But there's other, sorry, so, but the other question is, so when you send me the titles, so like political polarization, I was more thinking about, so the extent of polarization affect the economy instead of, okay, so you look at the two political view, right? Understand. So yeah, so in some sense, so what you find is very sensible and very interesting, right? But something is missing, or what I was looking for, or I find that it's going to be more interesting is to what extent a more polarized political situation leads to certain economic costs. What I mean is just maybe just compare like one state versus other state, or one country versus other country. So like in the country A, so it's more polarized than the other one. Certainly, I think so. Like everyone agrees. So right now, so the United States is more polarized than maybe like 10 or a generation ago, right? So the question was, okay, or the answer I was looking for is to what extent this more severe polarization affects our policy making and affects our economic outcome.
Yeah, no, yeah. So I'll be kind of short with this because I actually had scheduled like I need to jump to another Zoom thing right after. We're probably all jumping on Zooms. But the quick answer is that we were afraid that just a cross-sectional comparison of like counties that have more Republican voters or more Democrat voters and various economic outcomes is, I mean, like extremely endogenous. And there have been people that look at those cross-country comparisons. But we thought that this question about beliefs, like, I mean, there's a large behavioral macro literature, as you're probably following, about like, okay, people form beliefs about the economy. How does that actually influence consumption expenditures? And so we really wanted to lock in on that belief and expectation formation literature and get at it from that political affiliation side. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree that there's more scope to be done, especially in the macro literature. I mean, you think about heterogeneous agent models and people talk about hand-to-mouth consumers, but as people like save very little, save a lot. I think adding in as political affiliation heterogeneity would be very important for macro models.
Similar to some of the religion and political science literature, where it looks at the heterogeneity of religion and how that impacts political outcomes in a region. I would think that it's the same concept that he's describing, that level of heterogeneity. You know, I've seen Herfindahl indices calculated to try to measure that concentration of religion and what impact that has. So it would get at that too.
Yeah, no, that's true. A lot of these, I mean, beliefs are so highly correlated. I mean, political affiliation, religion, views about X, Y, and Z. So no, it's very true. Great. Well, really grateful again for all of your attention and great questions and engagement. Look forward to keeping in touch and seeing each other in person one of these days.
Okay,
All right.
thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, bye everybody. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.